In the early years of the Second World War, the skies over Germany belonged to the Luftwaffe. From Poland to France, from Norway to the Balkans, German fighter pilots had ruled the air with confidence and speed. They believed their homeland was untouchable from the sky. Enemy bombers might reach the edges of occupied Europe, but Berlin itself remained a distant dream for the Allies. German pilots were trained to believe one thing above all else: that no enemy fighter could escort bombers all the way to the heart of the Reich and still fight effectively. Range was the great limitation of air power, and the Luftwaffe understood it well. British Spitfires could defend England, but they could not fly deep into Germany. American fighters, early in the war, were no different. They lacked the fuel to go the distance. This belief shaped everything. By 1942, American bombers were appearing in growing numbers over occupied Europe. Massive formations of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators pushed deeper inland with each passing month. To German fighter pilots, these bombers were dangerous but predictable. They were slow, heavy, and vulnerable once they lost fighter protection. And that protection always ended. American fighters could escort bombers to a point, then they had to turn back. The Luftwaffe timed their attacks carefully, waiting for the moment when the escorts peeled away and the bombers were left alone. That was when German pilots struck, diving through tight formations of heavy bombers, firing cannons and machine guns into aluminum skins and fuel tanks. Losses were heavy on both sides, but the system worked. The Reich was bleeding, but it was not yet broken. Berlin still felt far away from the war in the air. Inside Luftwaffe briefing rooms, pilots spoke with confidence. They respected the American bombers, but they did not fear American fighters. The P-47 Thunderbolt was powerful but short-legged. The P-38 Lightning was fast but complex and limited in number. None of them, the Germans believed, could escort bombers all the way to Berlin. Then, in late 1943, something changed. At first, it was subtle. German pilots began encountering American fighters farther east than expected. Not just near the German border, but well inside it. These fighters were sleek, fast, and disturbingly persistent. They did not turn back when expected. They stayed with the bombers. Still, Berlin remained untouched. German radar stations continued to track incoming bomber streams. Controllers watched as formations crossed the coast, pushed inland, and were engaged by interceptors. Everything followed familiar patterns, until one morning the alarms did not stop. The bombers kept coming, deeper, farther, relentlessly eastward, and with them came fighters that refused to leave. On that day, Luftwaffe pilots scrambled, expecting the usual fight. Bombers protected only part of the way, followed by a brutal but manageable interception. Instead, as they climbed through cloud layers and leveled out at altitude, they saw something no one had expected to see over Germany's capital. American fighters, not near the border, not over industrial cities in the west, but high above Berlin itself. Silver aircraft with long wings and distinctive silhouettes moved confidently among the bomber formations. They were not defensive. They were hunting. These were P-51 Mustangs. 4 German pilots. The sight was shocking. The very foundation of their air defense doctrine collapsed in that moment. The assumption that American fighters could not reach Berlin was gone, shattered in an instant. The P-51 Mustang was unlike anything they had faced before. It was fast at altitude, agile in combat, and most terrifying of all, it had the range to escort bombers from England to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe pilots realized immediately what this meant. There would be no safe zone anymore. The bombers were no longer alone. German fighters diving toward the formations now found themselves intercepted almost immediately. P-51s broke away from escort positions, climbing and diving with ease, meeting German aircraft head-on or cutting them off during attack runs. For the first time, Luftwaffe pilots were being hunted over their own capital. Radio chatter turned frantic. Squadron leaders reported enemy fighters everywhere. Attacks that once ended with clean escapes now ended in sudden, violent dogfights. German pilots found themselves defending not just against bombers, but against an enemy that matched and often exceeded their own performance. And the worst realization came quickly. The Mustangs were not exhausted. They were not short on fuel. They were staying. As the battle unfolded over Berlin, the psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Pilots who had once believed the Reich was protected by distance now understood that distance no longer mattered. The Americans had solved the escort problem, and in doing so, they had cracked the Luftwaffe's last advantage. This was not just another air raid. It was the beginning of the end. For the Luftwaffe, the appearance of American fighters over Berlin was not just a tactical shock. It was a strategic nightmare unfolding in real time. German pilots had spent years perfecting interception methods designed around a simple truth. Bombers could be outlasted, outrun, or overwhelmed once their escorts turned back. That truth no longer existed. As P-51 Mustangs stayed with the bomber streams, German fighters were forced into a new kind of battle they were not prepared for. Every climb toward the bombers now carried danger. Every attack run risked interception before a single shot could be fired. The airspace that once belonged to the Luftwaffe had become contested and increasingly hostile. The Mustangs did not fly defensively. They flew aggressively. They climbed above the bombers, waited patiently, and then pounced on German fighters as they approached. In dogfights, the P-51 proved brutally effective. Its speed allowed it to choose when to fight and when to disengage. Its range meant it could stay in the air long after German pilots were forced to think about fuel. German squadron leaders began reporting losses that made no sense by earlier standards. Experienced pilots were being shot down over familiar terrain, sometimes before even reaching the bombers. Younger pilots, rushed into service to replace mounting casualties, stood little chance against American escort fighters flown by men who were now gaining experience at an alarming rate. The balance of skill was shifting. Before the Mustangs arrived, bomber losses had been severe enough to threaten the American daylight bombing campaign. Missions deep into Germany came with casualty rates that alarmed commanders and crews alike. Entire formations failed to return. Morale was strained, and questions were asked about whether unescorted daylight bombing could continue. The P-51 changed that equation completely. With long-range escort in place, American bomber losses began to fall. Not disappear, but decline to levels that could be sustained. German fighter losses, however, began to rise sharply. Each engagement over Germany cost the Luftwaffe irreplaceable pilots. Fuel shortages limited training. Replacement aircraft arrived faster than trained airmen could be produced. For German pilots, the realization was grim and unavoidable. They were losing the war in the air. The skies above Berlin, once a symbol of security, now became a killing ground. Air raid sirens wailed with increasing frequency as bomber streams returned again and again. Factories burned. Rail yards were smashed. Command centers were forced underground. And overhead, Mustangs roamed freely, hunting anything with a black cross on its wings. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe pilots cannot be overstated. These men had entered the war believing they were part of an elite force, guardians of the Reich, masters of the air. Now they found themselves outnumbered, outperformed, and increasingly outmatched. Each mission felt less like defense and more like survival. Veteran pilots began to sense something even more dangerous than defeat: hopelessness. The Mustang escort strategy did more than protect bombers. It forced the Luftwaffe to fight on American terms. German fighters could no longer choose when and where to engage. They were dragged into constant combat, bleeding away strength with every sortie. Aircraft that survived combat were often grounded due to lack of fuel or spare parts. Meanwhile, American production lines continued to operate at full capacity. For every German fighter lost, replacement became harder. For every American fighter lost, two more seemed to appear. The imbalance was becoming impossible to ignore. German intelligence officers reported the same disturbing conclusion from multiple fronts. The Americans had achieved air superiority over Germany itself. Not temporarily, not locally, but structurally. Berlin was no longer beyond reach. It was exposed, and as the Luftwaffe struggled to respond, American fighter pilots gained confidence. They no longer merely escorted bombers, they dominated the airspace. Strafing runs against airfields destroyed aircraft on the ground. German pilots were attacked during takeoff and landing, the most vulnerable moments of any mission. The air war had turned from defense into annihilation. German pilots who survived these missions spoke of a sky filled with enemies, of silver Mustangs appearing without warning, of radio calls cut short mid-sentence. The old confidence was gone, replaced by tension and fear that no amount of training could erase. This was not just a new aircraft. It was a new phase of the war. And for Germany, it was a phase they could not win. By the spring of 1944, the illusion was gone. The Luftwaffe was no longer choosing when and where to fight. It was reacting, scrambling, and bleeding. The appearance of P-51 Mustangs over Berlin had not shocked German pilots for a single day. It reshaped the entire air war forever. Every mission now began with dread. Sirens wailed, engines started, and fighters clawed their way upward through cold, thinning air. But before German pilots could even see the bombers, the Mustangs were already there, higher, faster, circling with patience and purpose. The first dives were brutal. Silver shapes fell out of the sun, tracers ripping through formations before warnings could be shouted. Radios exploded with frantic voices. Wingmen vanished in seconds. Leaders were singled out, hunted, and destroyed with terrifying precision. The American escorts were no longer defensive shields. They were predators. German tactics collapsed under the pressure. Intercept, fire once, disengage, the old rules no longer applied. Mustangs stayed with them, climbing again, diving again, refusing to break contact. Fuel gauges dropped. Ammunition ran dry. Escape became impossible. Pilots who tried to dive away were chased. Those who climbed were overtaken. There was nowhere left to run, and the losses never stopped. Experienced aces, the backbone of the Luftwaffe, disappeared week after week. Each veteran lost took with him years of combat knowledge that could never be replaced. New pilots arrived with barely enough training to survive a landing, now expected to fight the most advanced escort fighters in the world. They didn't stand a chance. Inside German headquarters, the numbers told a story no propaganda could hide. Fighter strength declined, even as American bomber formations grew larger. Fuel shortages grounded aircraft that still existed on paper. Training hours were slashed. Emergency measures became permanent policy. Meanwhile, the bombers kept coming. With the skies cleared, American commanders struck deeper and harder. Aircraft factories burned. Synthetic fuel plants were shattered. Rail hubs collapsed. Entire regions went dark. And above every target, Mustangs circled, calm, methodical, unstoppable. For civilians, the war changed tone. Bombing raids lasted longer. Fires spread unchecked. Cities once spared now vanished overnight. There was no relief, no pause, no sense that the Luftwaffe could intervene. German pilots knew the truth long before it was spoken aloud. They were no longer defending Germany. They were delaying its defeat by minutes, not days. Each takeoff felt like a final roll of the dice. Each landing, if it happened at all, felt borrowed. Across the channel, American airmen felt the shift as well. Missions that once felt like one-way journeys now carried confidence. Bombers returned with fewer empty seats. Escort pilots spoke openly of control, of owning the sky from England to Berlin and back again. The P-51 Mustang had done more than escort bombers. It had broken the balance. By the time Allied armies prepared to land in Europe, Germany's air shield was already shattered. The Luftwaffe still flew, still fought, but it no longer mattered. The skies belonged to someone else now. And once Germany lost the sky, everything beneath it became exposed. The ground war, the cities, the factories, all of it was about to feel the full weight of a war that could no longer be stopped from above. When the Allies crossed the Channel in June 1944, the outcome on the ground was already shaped by what had happened in the air. Long before the first landing craft hit the beaches, Germany had lost the ability to see, strike, or control its own skies. For the Luftwaffe, D-Day was not a surprise attack. It was an admission of failure. On the morning of the invasion, German pilots rushed to their aircraft expecting to meet massive air opposition. Instead, they found chaos. Airfields were cratered. Fuel was rationed to minutes. Radios crackled with incomplete orders. And above it all, Mustangs already ruled the sky. Attempts to intercept Allied aircraft failed almost instantly. Any German fighter that climbed was intercepted within minutes. P-51s dove aggressively, forcing engagements on their own terms. There were no safe altitudes left. No blind spots. No corridors of escape. Every approach route to Normandy was watched, patrolled, and controlled. The Luftwaffe had been reduced to fragments. Small groups took off, fought briefly, and were destroyed or driven away. Coordination was impossible. Veteran leaders were gone. Replacement pilots froze under pressure, overwhelmed by the speed and discipline of their enemy. American escort doctrine had reached full maturity. Mustangs did not simply guard bombers anymore. They hunted airfields. They loitered over known climb paths. They waited above clouds, engines throttled back, conserving fuel until German aircraft appeared, and then they struck. The psychological effect was devastating. German pilots spoke later of the feeling that the sky itself was hostile. Every contrail could be an ambush. Every sunlit cloud concealed death. Even when no enemy was visible, the threat was constant. Meanwhile, Allied bombers operated with near impunity. Supply lines feeding the front were destroyed faster than they could be repaired. Bridges vanished. Convoys burned in daylight. Trains were attacked repeatedly along predictable routes because Germany no longer had the fighters to protect them. The collapse was no longer theoretical. It was measurable. Fuel shortages worsened into paralysis. Aircraft sat idle not because they were damaged, but because there was nothing left to put in their tanks. Pilots trained on paper, not in the air. Experience vanished from the system entirely, and the Mustangs kept coming. From dawn until dusk, they dominated the airspace above France, Belgium, and Germany itself. They escorted bombers in the morning, strafed transport in the afternoon, and hunted fighters whenever they dared to rise. By late summer 1944, the Luftwaffe existed mostly in reports and memories. It could still fight isolated battles. It could still inflict losses, but it could no longer influence the war's direction. The initiative was gone. Control was gone. Hope was thinning with every sortie. Germany had not just lost air superiority. It had lost the ability to recover it. And as the ground armies pushed deeper into Europe, the truth became unavoidable. Without control of the sky, defeat was no longer a question of if, only how fast. By the autumn of 1944, the collapse was no longer subtle. It was visible everywhere the Luftwaffe tried to operate. What remained of Germany's fighter force was being consumed faster than it could be replaced, not by massive battles, but by relentless pressure. Every takeoff carried the weight of finality. Pilots knew that climbing to altitude meant exposure. They knew escorts would already be waiting. The confidence that once defined German airmen was gone, replaced by calculation and fear. Many no longer asked how to win a fight, only how to survive it. Desperation bred improvisation. Germany rushed experimental aircraft into service. Jet fighters like the Me-262 promised speed beyond anything the Allies possessed, but they arrived too late and in too few numbers. Fuel shortages limited training. Mechanical failures grounded squadrons. And even jets were vulnerable during takeoff and landing, where Mustangs waited patiently. The air war became one-sided attrition. American fighters did not need perfect conditions. They flew in bad weather. They hunted in small groups. They rotated pilots efficiently, preserving experience instead of burning it. Losses were absorbed, lessons learned, tactics refined. Germany could do none of this. Every lost pilot was irreplaceable. Every aircraft destroyed represented weeks of work and resources that no longer existed. Bombing had crippled factories. Transportation networks lay shattered. Even spare parts were scavenged from wrecks. Morale disintegrated. Veteran pilots warned newcomers to stay low, to disengage early, to avoid combat whenever possible. Orders contradicted reality. Commanders demanded results the Luftwaffe could no longer deliver. The gap between expectation and capability widened into despair. And still the Mustangs came. They escorted bombers deeper into Germany than anyone had thought possible. They flew over cities once considered untouchable. They chased fighters back to their runways and destroyed them on the ground. German pilots later described the feeling of being hunted not just in the air, but everywhere. There was no sanctuary left. By early 1945, sorties became symbolic. A few aircraft launched. A few engagements occurred. Losses mounted. And nothing changed. The Allied advance continued, unstoppable and methodical. The Luftwaffe had not been defeated in a single decisive battle. It had been bled dry. Every advantage stripped away. Every weakness exploited. Every attempt at recovery crushed before it could take form. What remained was not an air force, but a shadow, unable to protect cities, supply armies, or challenge the enemy in any meaningful way. The war in the air was effectively over, and everyone involved knew it. In the end, it was not courage that failed Germany in the skies, nor skill, nor even technology. It was scale. The Luftwaffe had been built for short wars, decisive blows, and controlled skies. It was never designed to fight an enemy who could replace losses endlessly, train pilots methodically, and improve tactics faster than they could be countered. America fought a different kind of war. Factories replaced squadrons faster than they could be destroyed. Training pipelines produced pilots faster than they could be lost. Fuel flowed, spare parts arrived, and experience was preserved instead of squandered. The P-51 Mustang was not just an aircraft. It was the visible proof of an industrial truth Germany could not escape. When Mustangs appeared over Berlin, it was not merely a tactical shock. It was a psychological one. The last illusion of safety vanished. The heart of the Reich lay exposed, day after day, with no answer. German pilots later admitted something remarkable. They did not lose because they flew poorly. They lost because they were outnumbered beyond reason. They lost because every victory cost them something they could never replace. They lost because the enemy adapted faster than they could react. By 1945, the Luftwaffe was no longer fighting for air superiority. It was fighting for relevance. And even that battle was lost. Cities burned without defense. Armies moved without cover. Orders were issued that could not be obeyed. Sacrifice no longer altered outcomes. For the men who once ruled Europe's skies, the realization was devastating. The war had already been decided, not in the cockpit, but in factories, shipyards, and training fields thousands of miles away. When Allied troops crossed into Germany, the silence above them said everything. No interceptors, no resistance, no challenge. The sky belonged to someone else now. And in that silence, the Luftwaffe's defeat was complete. They lost because the enemy adapted faster than they could react. By 1945, the Luftwaffe was no longer fighting for air superiority. It was fighting for relevance. And even that battle was lost. Cities burned without defense. Armies moved without cover. Orders were issued that could not be obeyed. Sacrifice no longer altered outcomes. For the men who once ruled Europe's skies, the realization was devastating. The war had already been decided, not in the cockpit, but in factories, shipyards, and training fields thousands of miles away. When Allied troops crossed into Germany, the silence above them said everything. No interceptors, no resistance, no challenge. The sky belonged to someone else now. And in that silence, the Luftwaffe's defeat was complete.